You remember a couple of weeks ago we started a little small series on basically extraordinary. Extraordinary, if you remember, comes from the Latin mean extraordinary, or we gave a definition of out of the normal course of events. Just normal people not doing what normal people would do, doing something that wouldn't be normal. We thought about just our history when you have the naval battle when Jones's ship was sinking in the war, and they said, asked him, are you willing, ready to surrender as his ship was sinking? And what did he say? We've just begun to fight. And it's amazing, how we remember that many years later. But another one that I went to, and it's been 45 years ago, I was at the privilege of going to Bastogne. And if you've ever been to Bastogne, France, what happened right outside of Bastogne? Those of you who know your history, what happened just outside of Bastogne? Tipping scale of World War II. Battle of the Bulge. Right outside of the battle, the Germans had far superior, had better troops, so far the numbers. They had better tanks as well as more tanks. Everything they had was superior. And the American general was asked to surrender. And what was his term? Nuts. And the Germans did not know what it meant. And it bought the Americans some time, and they're just using slang when he said nuts. We're not going to do that. And they're trying to figure out what nuts mean. They're looking at pecans, we know what is it, But again, extraordinary, and that was the turning point, one of the turning points of the war. It's where Jean's great uncle, who I had to get permission to marry Jean from, he lost his hearing at the Battle of the Bulge, and later became the generals defending Washington, D.C. Quite well-known individual, and really a sharp man. But you had extraordinary people, but they're just ordinary people doing it. You remember a couple weeks ago we saw Joseph, and the part we were looking at with Joseph was in Genesis 15, verse 20. This is just a review. Remember when he could have sought revenge, but remember he said, God, you meant it for harm, but God meant it to protect you, and I will, now after the Father is gone, I will also comfort you and even provide for you, even though they treated, obviously, his brothers very poorly. So the one we saw there, extraordinary, was just how Joseph forgave him. We saw Moses, in which he had leading those people who were not exactly the greatest people to lead. And when he had a chance to basically get rid of them and God make a nation out of his people, he said what? He interceded for them, so as others over self. Most of us would do what? Get rid of them. Others over self. But then remember we saw Joshua and Caleb, and if you remember, they said, what? Those two said, no, we can take this. God's taken away their defense. They have better military, they have walled cities, better weapons, more people, but we can do it. Because we are, what I titled was the faith talking, faith walking. Hey, we can do it. And even at 85, what did Caleb say? Give me the mountain where the giants are at. I'm going to go take them. And he did. We then saw David, and just how when he was 17 roughly, when he was anointed king, but he was willing to wait on God to take Saul out. When he had his opportunity twice to kill Saul, or have his men kill him, he said, no, we don't touch God's anointed. We allow God to take him out. The faith waiting. I think a lot of us have a lot of trouble with waiting on God. And the last one we looked at was just a couple weeks ago, was out of the servant Obadiah. And if you remember, Obadiah was under probably the two combination, king and queen, and one of the worst in Israel's history when you combine the two, Ahab and Jezebel. And when they had the drought, what did Obadiah the servant do? He hides 100 prophets of God that Jezebel's trying to kill, and he provides water and food for them. Now where in the world is he getting the water and food from? Well, you think about it, he'd be getting some of that food would be coming from the king's table, and if Ahab or Jezebel found out about it, what would happen to him? Okay, so he feared God more than he feared man. And I think for a lot of us, is that really what we have? So today, I come down to another one, extraordinary individual. And it's I was reading too this past week about, in fact, the second time I read about it, a group of tribes people in Australia. And this tribal group in Australia has no words in their language for right or left. So how do you give directions? They do everything based on north, south, east, and west. And they said that all of them know exactly. So they thought, well, they're going to take this. So they took some of these tribal people, they took them to other cities, put them in rooms, blindfolded them, did everything where they could have any bearing, didn't know anything about it. And without exception, every single one of them, every single time, could tell you where north was inside of a room out in a city that had never been to blindfolded. Now, how was it that they had this internal deal? They were in India and found out the same thing among some tribes people, but as they got exposed to more and more modern technology, what happened to them? They lost a lot of that. So what makes me think then, when it comes down to today, is how many of us, what do we need? A compass. And what does a compass do? Does a compass tell you where you're at? Okay, a compass, if you look at it, it's going to point north, will it not? It's going to point north, so in a sense it tells you where you're at because it tells you which way is north. So I think a lot of us, we need to have a compass, and the compass needs to be telling where we're at. It's going to tell us where we need to go and need to be focused on God. So let's look at a man that I have greatly appreciated over the last almost 50 years. And look over in the book of Nehemiah. And the reason it means a lot to me, when I was 19 years old, I was asked to be a dorm supervisor, which I was a sophomore, so you're supervising people who are a year younger than you, or some of them are your age. And where I went to school, there happened to be 3 floors on this particular dorm, and you had a different person on each floor in charge. Well, I was on the bottom floor in charge of the people on my floor. The 2 above me, and at the dorm where the rules that we had is you had to make your bed every day by such and such time. You had to keep the room clean. You had to be in at such and such time at night. As freshmen, this is freshman dorm, you had to be in studying, and you had to be in the dorm by, these different rules you had, and if you didn't, you got demerits, and if you got 30 demerits, you were campus for the weekend. And you couldn't go out. They said, go eat, come home, go back. Well, if you're over in charge of it, what are you supposed to be doing? Well, the 2 above could care less, and they didn't care if you made your bed, they didn't care when you went out or when you came back in. So but they were getting paid, so they weren't doing the job. But I was getting paid, so what should I do? Do the job. So how well do you think you're being received among the people who you're over? And so I got a lot of very nasty words to me at times. In fact, one got really bad. He later left the school after the year. And to his credit, he went to school down in Houston. And the Lord had convicted him. And the following year, he made a trip through Birmingham and stopped by and said, to apologize, and said, all the things I said to you, I was wrong. I had to give him a lot of credit, because how many of us would have made a special trip to stop by and do it at any age, let alone at 19. So Nehemiah, I was reading through it during all this time that was going on. It really helped me. So let's look at Nehemiah. And I like to call it faith building, an extraordinary man. When you look at it, in verse 1 to verse 3, you find out what the problem is. And he is a cupbearer, and he's living in Susa, the capital. And his brother is in Jerusalem. So you're talking about a long way away. And you're a cupbearer. Now, what's so unusual about Nehemiah being a cupbearer? What nationality is Nehemiah?
Jewish.
And what nationality is the king? Okay. What's the quickest way you kill a king in that day?
Food.
Or what he eats and what he drinks. What do you remember? What happened with Joseph with the cupbearer and so on? It happened so often they were killed through what they ate or they drank. So it's very, very unusual to have a foreigner as your cupbearer. Because if you're a foreigner, you were captured and your people are captured. Really unusual to have you as a cupbearer. It has to be very trustworthy. So obviously, you think about it, Nehemiah, in a sense, has got a pretty good job of being a foreigner. And he finds out in verse 2 and 3 just how bad Jerusalem is. His brother is still there, and he tells him about how the walls are broken down, the gates are burned with fire, and things are really bad. Very similar to how many of us, when we hear about what's going on in India and Myanmar, long way away, and what we have any concern for. So here you have it, and when he hears it, it's interesting, he starts to pray, and if you notice the month is this Chislev in verse 1, that's November, December. So he hears about this news, and he starts to pray. And he starts to praise, he praises God, and he starts praying, and in verse 6 you notice he prays day and night. And it's interesting, he uses the word we, in like verse 6, we have sinned, we have committed and acted corruptly against. He recognizes the predicament that they're in as a people, and we were wrong. The same thing with our country, we are doing a lot of things that are wrong, but he recognizes it. He then starts asking the Lord for favor, especially notice in verse 11 of chapter 1. O Lord, I beseech thee, may thine ear be attentive to prayer of thy servant, and prayer of thy servants who delight to revere thy name, and make thy servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. Who's this man?
King.
The king. Okay, so he's wanting compassion. He starts praying, and he keeps praying, and he keeps praying. He starts in November, December. You notice in chapter 2 and verse 1, it came about the month of Nisan, which is what?
The spring.
March and April. So how long did he pray? 3 to 4 months. Praying over and over, morning, noon, and night. But what you also have, you are not allowed to ever be sad in the king's presence. So if you're, no matter what you felt like when you went in the king's presence, what do you have to do?
Smile.
All right. You notice he comes in his presence and he's not smiling, and you notice the king sees it. So the king said to him, why is your face sad, though you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. Why? Because off with your head. I never want anything like that in my presence. You can see why he's been praying for all this time. So he's praying 3 to 4 months, probably 4 months, for success when he comes to the king, and now the king asks you what's wrong. And what would you say?
Nothing.
Seriously, is this the time? You've been praying for 4 months. Lord, what can I do to help Jerusalem? That many miles away. I'm a cupbearer. I only can get help from the king. What can he now asks him? Now it's interesting what he does. Now he now tells him in verse 3 about the city. The king asks, what is your request? And notice in verse 4 it says he does what?
Pray.
What kind of prayer do you think it is? You're standing before the king, and the king looks out at you and says, what do you want, Grady? And Grady, you start praying. What kind of prayer is that going to be?
Quick.
A quick, silent prayer. Notice there's a time in chapter 1 for the long prayer, and there's a time for the quick, silent prayer. So he's now praying. He asks God. So notice what he does. He now then asks him specifically for help to rebuild Jerusalem. It's interesting, the king are there in verse 6. How long will your journey be? When will you return? So it pleased the king, and I gave him a definite answer. Why do you think God had him wait for 4 months?
Working on the king's heart.
Working on the king's heart, but would you have known and thought through all these things? Notice something else you thought through. In it, and I said to the king, if you please the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass. They aren't going to allow him to go through these other territories from Susa to Jerusalem. But if you have the king's signature, what's going to happen? So notice that he's thought through this. He's thought how long he was going to be gone. He thought that he needed to have letters to get there. What else did he think about in verse 8? Notice in verse 8, he asks God for what?
Lumber.
Okay, I'm going to have materials. Now here you have, they destroyed the walled city of Jerusalem because the people wouldn't give up. Why would you want to rebuild a city, a walled city, so they then could go against you in future time? But the king does. And notice why he allows him to have the lumber. So the king is paying to rebuild Jerusalem. And notice then, Nehemiah says the good hand was with him. And Nehemiah recognizes, why is he getting these things? God gives him the credit. He gives God the credit for these different things. And notice as he goes through it, he gives it to him. And you get to verse 10, and you're going to find some people who are going to be very displeased with him. Sanballat, Tobiah, and then there'll be a third one. These three individuals are going to oppose him all the way through. So here you started off, you have a problem, and you start praying, and God gives you a provision. Have you ever built a wall? Do you even know how the wall looks? No. You think about it, here you are, cupbearer. If anybody had an excuse not to go, Lord, I don't know what it looks like. I have no provisions. I've never built a wall in my life. I have no workers. I can't do it by myself. Every excuse you can think of, he could have used. But God laid it on his heart. He started to pray about it. And after the 4 months, he had thought of the different things he would need. So he gets to Jerusalem, and you notice then in verse, for 3 days he comes. He goes up at night, in verse 12, and a few men with him. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting in my mind to do for Jerusalem. There was not an animal with me except the animal which I rode. And notice then from verse 13 and 14 and 15, he goes and inspects all the walls and all the gates. How discouraging do you think that would be? You see what all needs to take place. All right. God is putting a plan on his, but has he told anybody yet? So now, after God has told you all these things, you notice then he comes back, in verse 16, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. Then I said, notice it's interesting, you see the bad situation we are in. Why does he use the word we? He's not going to stay there. He's going back. Notice he goes up, let us rebuild the wall that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them how the hand of God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which had spoken to me. Then they said, let us rise and build. So they put their hand to the good work. So here they are. It's amazing just for that many things to take place. You start to pray. God, and a lot of times it's just prayer, and God has other people do the work. But this time God laid a plan on his heart. He gave them provisions. He goes out and he starts building it. But when you start building things or doing things for the Lord that God wants you to do, what's going to happen? You think you'll ever have problems? You're going to have constant problems. It's interesting with Nehemiah that each time, you'll notice starting in 19, Sanballat and Tobiah start to mock him. And they start doing this right at the beginning. And they started, and all the way through, you're going to find that they're going to be rebelling. And so it's interesting how they start to do it, and they give credit where they're doing it. But if you go over to chapter 4, let's look at some of the problems. As they continue to rebuild the wall, they're starting to work on it, and they're doing a good job. Notice in verse 1, Sanballat becomes furious, very angry, and mocks the Jews. And you'll notice then Tobiah in verse 3, what does he say? Even when they're building, if a fox jumped on it, he would break the stone down. How light-footed is a fox? So here they're taking, remember a lot of these rocks, it was burned. What happens when you burn rock? What's the strength and stuff of them? So you think about it, they're building it, and what's one of the quickest ways to discourage people and get them to quit they start to ridicule and everything else. So they start off with this mockery, and you'll notice in verse 4 and 5, what does Nehemiah do? Every time there's an opposition, you'll find in this book, this is what Nehemiah does. Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return the reproach on their heads. Give them up for plunder in the land of captivity. Do not forgive them. They have demoralized the builders. So we built the wall, and the whole wall is joined together, half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Notice what does Nehemiah do? He turns it over to the Lord, and he keeps working. You notice the second problem. You notice Sanballat and Tobiah in verse 7. They start to, in verse 8, they conspire together to come fight. So now they're going to go, all the surrounding nations don't want Jerusalem to be rebuilt. So they're now going to come and attack them before the wall's finished. And notice in verse 9, what do? We pray to our God, and because of them, we set up guards against them day and night. So now you have to set up a guard. How well are you going to sleep? You never know when they're coming. You don't know where they're coming. You don't have very many people in the city. You start setting up a guard. Notice, new opposition, conspiracy. They're going to come, and you start praying. And they were told that 10 different times. But they carry on. They're carrying their, you notice in 21, they carry their spears from dawn until the stars appear. So they have their weapon on one side of them, and their brick and mortar on the other side of them. It's also interesting when you look at what Nehemiah does. He always turns it to the Lord, but he does some other wise things. Hey, I want everybody to carry their weapon with them. But where would you defend most, Norman? Would you defend Broken Arrow, or would you defend off of Highway 20 the best?
Off of Highway 20 the best. Just
Well,
say,
why?
I don't know, because it's where Michelle lives.
Ah. Brian, would you defend Broken Arrow, or would you defend Ramona better?
Well,
He puts everybody where their family is. Because they're not going to flee. They're going to want to build that wall well, and they're going to defend it well. But every time he has a plan, but he always turns it over to the Lord. Does he have a compass? Does he know where he's at? And does he keep it lined up with God? Always doing. He came to build the wall, and he's going to keep his eye and focus on building the wall. But he also, every time problems come, he prays. Every time. It's interesting, the next one comes down in chapter 5. You have another one in this extortion. And it's interesting how they do that. But it's interesting, one thing about Nehemiah, I think it's interesting. Notice in verse 14 of what you have of chapter 5. It says, "More from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land, from the 20th year to the 32nd year, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. For the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took for them bread and wine besides the 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord." What kind of governor was he? Did he take what was even his allotted amount?
No.
Why not? Because the people were in such poverty. In fact, it's going to show you later in the book, he fed them out of his own pocket. I mean, a leader, 12 years he was doing it. So he gave them, so he's doing this, and it's interesting how he does it. Notice the next thing comes. So anytime there's opposition, you're building and there's things are going, and you'll notice he ends up and he's asked the Lord then basically to turn it over in verse 19 of chapter 5. He's asking the Lord to remember what he's done. But notice in chapter 6 and verse 1 to 4, and what they do, they want to compromise. And since they can't get to Nehemiah, the Tobiah and Sanballat, and Geshem, the Arab, in verse 2 say, "Hey, come out and meet us. We want to talk to you." If you leave the walled city and go out to meet him, what's going to happen, you think, Aaron?
Be defenseless.
They're going to attack Nehemiah and kill him? And what's going to happen to it if the leader's gone?
Bring down.
It'll stop. Notice how he responds. It's neat. In verse 3, "So I sent my messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work and can't come down. Why should the work stop while I leave and come down to you?" Did he keep his compass focused? Hey, don't get me sidetracked. It's not important. I'm not going to do it. It's interesting when you look at John chapter 4 when Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman. Do you realize he only answers the questions that are pertinent to the subject? Half the questions she asked, he does not address. He doesn't get sidetracked. How many times have we ever gotten sidetracked? Are people pretty good at getting you sidetracked when you're getting close to home? Shelley, did students ever try to get you sidetracked when they knew a test was coming so you didn't cover enough material?
Every single week.
Every single week. Yep. They're very good at it. Sometimes you catch on and sometimes you realize it a little late. But notice he caught on. He knew, no, I'm not coming down here. So since they can't do that, notice they come to another one. By the way, who volunteered for this job?
You did it.
How many of you are getting a little tired of hey, God, I'm volunteering, I'm working hard. I don't need all this stuff. Notice chapter 6 and verse 5, the next one, they send an open letter. Now what would be an open letter? This wouldn't be just to Nehemiah, this would be read out loud. And it's read out loud to everybody. So if I can't get Nehemiah, if I can get the people, the workers, to quit, then hey, Nehemiah can't do it by himself. So notice then, what they're talking about here is the slander that they have is in verse 6 and 7. And what they're saying is, well, Nehemiah is wanting you to rebuild the wall because he wants to become king. And when he becomes king and he sets himself up as king, well, what's the real king in Susa going to do?
Fight.
He'll come and destroy the city. So hey, do you guys really want to rebuild this wall? Because Nehemiah is going to become king, and notice that's going to be devastating on your part. So don't build this wall. Don't follow Nehemiah because he's in it for the wrong reason. And notice once again, in verse 9, they say all these things to discourage the people. In the end of verse 9, what does Nehemiah do? He turns it over to the Lord and asks the Lord to strengthen his hand. Each time, he recognizes the opposition and he turns it over to the Lord. Every time. The next one is treachery, and what happens, this was set up from the inside. And the inside is when they basically say, well, they're coming to attack. This is in verse 6, chapter 6, verse 10. And we want Nehemiah, you need to flee and go into the temple, the Holy of Holies, or into the inner part. Okay? So in other words, if you want to be spared, you better get inside because the attack is coming. What happens if Nehemiah goes in there? Is he allowed in there?
No.
So if he goes in there, he breaks the Old Testament law, and what are they supposed to do if he does that?
Kill him.
Kill him. And you'll notice then it's interesting in verse 12 of chapter 6. Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. So here you have a prophet that's being hired from the outside telling him to do it. How did he figure this out? God showed him. And he doesn't do it. And notice again in verse 14, he turns it over to the Lord and says, Lord, you need to take care of it. And it's amazing when you look at it, all this opposition. Notice in verse 15 then. So the wall was completed on the 25th day of the month of Elul. In how many days?
50.
Now how remarkable is that? The entire wall is rebuilt under these kind of circumstances in 52 days. And why was it? Because the people had a mind to work, and Nehemiah did what? Kept them focused, and he kept turning it over to the Lord, turning it over to the Lord, giving the response, turning it over to the Lord. And I think it's amazing when you look at it, how this takes place. But I think it's interesting when you get to the pattern that you have on so much of this, and it's just how so often you have when Nehemiah does these kind of things, that he's doing what was right. And I think it's important for all of us to look at it and think about it. Even afterward with Nehemiah, his pattern was he didn't charge the people. He did what was right. And so you think about it, with Nehemiah, did he build the wall by faith? There's a lot of hard work, but he went before the king, the guy laid a plan on his heart, and he did it. But let me ask you some questions. Despite your credentials, age, or resources, is God laying on your heart to do something? You know? Brian's a little old to go get his master's degree for teaching or counseling, isn't he?
No.
Okay? No, I'm just saying this. Well, you know, you think about, wasn't Jerry just a little old to go get a nursing degree? If that's what God's laying on your heart, when did Moses start leading the children of Israel?
He was 80.
He's 80. Okay? I think it's important to recognize so often it's not the age that matters. You have so many other things that take place too. Am I going to go do what he's asking me to do? How are you going to do it? Maybe God's laying on your heart to do something, you don't know how to do it. So what should you do if you're going to be like Nehemiah? Pray. All right, I don't know how to do it. I don't have the resources. Okay? No. How did New Life Ranch get started? Anybody know? How many of you know about New Life Ranch? Okay, how did it get started?
One man had a vision.
One man had a vision that Bob knows from his youth. You ever hear a man by the name of Mr. Heck?
Yep.
And what did he do?
He came around to country schools and put on programs and taught kids that didn't know about Jesus, taught them the Bible.
He had a vision for a camp.
Yep.
It was not having a dime really to his name. He put a down payment on just under 1,000 acres just out of Siloam Springs for a camp. And today it's one of the nicest camps you can go to. And he and Ruth, it cost him a great deal, but he had a vision. I don't know how to do it. If that's what you want me to do, I'll take the first step. So it's interesting when you look at it. Sometimes we have to wait and pray. We need to get started. Nehemiah started with prayer, and then he started with asking for the supplies, asking for the passage. Then when he gets there, he has the supplies and the passage, but he still has to inspect to see. Each time there's opposition, what do we need to do? Pray, turn it over to the Lord, and quit. Right?
Keep on.
Keep on going. And I think a lot of times, it may be somebody else that completes it. But it's interesting with the temple, you have the same thing. It was completed later. So I had others I wanted to look at, but I don't think I want to do justice to 5 minutes to start on one. But just thinking about Nehemiah, all of us, no matter what our age is, what our occupation is, an ordinary person who will get the compass correct and focused on the Lord, God will have us do something. Will have us do something. It's interesting too. Who was Gideon's servant? Anybody know? Interesting. You look at Gideon's servant. It said, Gideon, if you're too scared to go down to the camp, take your servant with you, and named the servant. How would you like to be the servant? You're going into the camp of 135,000 people with just 2 of you. I'm glad that they included the servant, because it was important to them. So let's think about it. So let's think about it. So let's think about it. So let's think about it.